Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're heading over to Hong Kong to explore a story that's both captivating and complex. Our source material is an interview with a 76-year-old man named Mr. Young, featured on a YouTube channel called Muchla. That's emotional support group in Cantonese.
It's a unique window into a very specific subculture, and Mr. Young certainly doesn't hold back.
He really doesn't. He openly discusses his four marriages, his experiences dating after divorce, and several relationships with Filipino women. He even shares some rather, shall we say, unconventional advice on keeping his love life active at his age. But beneath the surface, this story offers some thought-provoking insights into aging loneliness and cross-cultural relationships in a modern metropolis.
Right. It would be easy to get caught up in the more sensational aspects. But if we listen carefully, we can learn quite a bit about the societal forces at play in Mr. Young's life.
So to start, Mr. Young paints a picture of his current situation: divorce, living alone, and feeling isolated. He's very upfront about his desire for companionship.
And this resonates with a larger issue in Hong Kong and many urban centers, actually. Social isolation among older adults is a growing concern, and it can significantly impact well-being. In fact, studies have shown.
We'll get to those studies in a bit. First, let's go back to Mr. Young's relationship history. He doesn't go into great detail about his four marriages, but we do learn that three of his wives were from mainland China, and he even gave one of them his public housing flat.
That's quite a detail. It hints at the complexities of those relationships and the cultural dynamics at play. But it's after his last divorce that Mr. Young's story takes a turn, leading him to pursue relationships with women significantly younger than himself.
Specifically Filipino women, often with an age gap of 30 years or more. And the ways he meets them are quite striking, from asking for directions on the street to connecting through Facebook groups.
That raises some immediate questions about power imbalances, cultural perceptions, and the factors that bring these individuals together. We'll definitely want to delve into those aspects further.
Absolutely. So let's talk about his first encounter with the Filipino woman. It's a bit of a whirlwind. He meets her when she asks him for directions, and he boldly invites her out. He's surprised when she refuses money for transportation, which already hints at cultural differences and expectations.
Yes, that small detail speaks volumes. It highlights the potential for misunderstandings in cross-cultural interactions, and how even seemingly simple gestures can be interpreted in very different ways.
And there seem to be more misunderstandings as their connection develops. He describes her as affectionate, even expressing a desire to marry him. But, like many of his relationships with Filipino women, it ends abruptly when her work contract expires and she returns to the Philippines.
Which is a crucial point. Many Filipino women come to Hong Kong as domestic workers under temporary contracts, facing numerous restrictions and uncertainties. That precarity undoubtedly shapes their relationships and life choices.
Mr. Young doesn't spend much time on the second and third Filipino women he was involved with. We just know that things didn't work out for reasons he attributes to their perceived greed. And then comes a particularly jarring incident where a Filipino woman and her sister attempt to steal from him.
That's where we see a shift in Mr. Young's perspective. He begins to view Filipino women with suspicion and generalization, highlighting how personal experiences, while valid, can sometimes lead to biased views.
It's a good reminder that we need to be cautious about forming broad judgments based on limited encounters.
Exactly. And this brings us to Mr. Young's longest relationship, 2 years, with a woman he met on Facebook. This is where his account gets incredibly personal, sometimes even uncomfortably so.
He doesn't shy away from intimate details describing their sexual encounters, and even making some generalizations about Filipino women's behavior and preferences based on his experience with this one individual.
And that's where we need to be careful. It's important to remember that his individual experience shouldn't be extrapolated to an entire group of people.
He also makes some interesting observations. He fixates on a mole near her genitals, claiming that in Chinese culture, it's a sign of promiscuity. It's a reminder that he's bringing his own cultural biases and assumptions into these relationships, which can be problematic.
It is. Attributing specific personality traits to physical characteristics is not only inaccurate, but also potentially harmful.
And despite claiming a very active sex life with this woman up to 3 times a day, he eventually discovers she's married with children back in the Philippines. And to make matters worse, she ends up stealing valuable jewelry from him and disappears.
It's a heartbreaking turn of events, both for Mr. Young and potentially for the woman involved. It raises questions about her motivations and the pressures she might have been facing, reminding us that there are often unseen circumstances at play.
And this betrayal deeply affects him. He reports the theft to the police, but they discourage him from pursuing charges, leaving him feeling let down by the justice system and filled with bitterness.
It's understandable that he feels that way. Experiences of theft and betrayal can be incredibly traumatic, especially when compounded by a sense of powerlessness.
And throughout all of this, Mr. Young consistently boasts about his sexual prowess. He attributes it to a special soup he makes with fish heads. It's rather humorous detail, but it also speaks to his desire to maintain his virility and desirability as an older man.
That's a recurring theme in his narrative. He seems to be grappling with societal expectations about what it means to be an older man, and is pushing back against the invisibility that often comes with age.
He's almost trying to rewrite the narrative of what an older man can be, even if his methods are unconventional.
Exactly. And there's one final detail that really underscores the emotional complexity of these relationships. The woman who stole from him actually contacted him the morning of the interview, which he found upsetting because she had blocked him on social media.
It shows just how tangled and emotionally charged these connections can be, even when they've been marked by conflict and betrayal. There's clearly more to this story than meets the eye.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so fascinating. There are layers of cultural dynamics, personal experiences, and societal expectations at play here. It really does make you wonder about the motivations and complexities behind her actions. We're reminded that there are often unseen pressures and personal stories we don't have access to.
It's easy to form judgments based on Mr. Young's account, but there's always another side to this story.
Right, and it's interesting how Mr. Young contrasts his experiences with Filipino women to those with women from mainland China. He makes some pretty bold statements, even going so far as to say he prefers Filipino women because they're more stimulating and adventurous in his view.
He certainly doesn't hold back on his opinions, does he? And he's very direct about what he's looking for in a partner, focusing a lot on the physical aspects of relationships.
And that's where we have to be careful. While it's one thing to acknowledge his personal preferences, it's crucial to remember that his generalizations about entire groups of women stem from his limited experience and likely reflect cultural stereotypes.
It's a good point. We can't assume his views represent the reality of all Filipina or mainland Chinese women. We need to be mindful of those biases and avoid perpetuating harmful stereotypes ourselves.
Exactly. It's important to remember that this interview itself exists within a specific cultural context. The YouTube channel Emotional Support Group seems to cater to a particular audience, and there's always a degree of performance involved in these online interviews.
So we're not just hearing Mr. Young's raw, unfiltered thoughts. He's presenting himself to an audience, and that inevitably influences how he shares his story and which details he chooses to emphasize.
Precisely. So while his story is undoubtedly compelling and offers valuable insights, we need to approach it with a healthy dose of critical thinking and awareness of the potential biases at play.
Now, I have to ask about his claims regarding fish head soup. He attributes his stamina and prowess to this special concoction. Do you think there's any merit to that?
Well, I'm not a nutritionist, but I'd be inclined to chalk it up to the power of belief. It's probably more of a placebo effect. If you believe it works, it might have a psychological impact.
So more about confidence than actual ingredients. Makes sense.
There's also a cultural element to consider. Traditional Chinese medicine places a lot of emphasis on the link between food and health. It's not surprising that Mr. Young would attribute his vitality to a specific dish.
It's a good reminder that cultural beliefs and practices can significantly shape our views of ourselves and our bodies.
Speaking of which, this ties back into the theme of aging that runs throughout Mr. Young's story. He seems to be actively challenging societal expectations of what it means to be an older man, particularly when it comes to his romantic and sexual life.
It's almost like he's pushing back against the idea that older men should fade into the background. He's determined to maintain an active and, as he puts it, stimulating life.
I think you're right. He's using his sexuality as a way to assert his agency and challenge those limiting notions about aging.
And there's a certain rebellious spirit in that, wouldn't you say? He's not letting societal norms dictate his desires or his experiences.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that people can defy those expectations and write their own narratives even later in life. But it's also important to acknowledge that his approach does raise some ethical questions about power imbalances in relationships.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored Mr. Young's relationship history, his cultural biases, his unique approach to dating, his beliefs about fish head soup, and his desire to defy societal expectations. But what does it all mean? What are the key takeaways here?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think at its heart, Mr. Young's story is a call for us to examine our own assumptions and biases. It prompts us to consider the complexities of cross-cultural relationships, the challenges of aging in a rapidly changing world, and the universal desire for connection and intimacy, regardless of age or circumstance.
It's a powerful reminder that everyone has a story, and even the most seemingly outlandish narratives can offer us valuable insights into the human condition.
Exactly. Mr. Young's experience, though unique to him, gives us a glimpse into a larger social fabric, a world of cultural intersections, shifting demographics, and the complexities of aging in a globalized city like Hong Kong.
And it's a world that deserves our attention and empathy, even when it challenges our preconceptions and makes us uncomfortable.
It certainly does,
Yeah.
because it's through understanding and engaging with these complexities that we can foster greater compassion and connection across cultures and generations. But I think it's also essential to bring in some additional perspectives here. We focused a lot on Mr. Young's point of view, but what about the experiences of Filipino domestic workers in Hong Kong?
That's a critical point. Their voices are essential to understanding the full picture. We know they often face difficult working conditions, social isolation, and limited opportunities. There's a whole other layer to this story that needs to be explored.
And there's a wealth of research and personal accounts that can shed light on their experiences. For example, a 2023 study by Insert Name of Research Organization found that cite a relevant statistic or finding from a study about Filipino domestic workers in Hong Kong.
That's just one example, of course. There are many organizations and individuals working to advocate for the rights and well-being of Filipino domestic workers in Hong Kong.
Absolutely. And their stories often reveal the challenges and complexities of navigating cross-cultural relationships, particularly when power imbalances and economic disparities are at play.
It's a reminder that we need to be mindful of the broader context and the systemic factors that shape these relationships.
Right. And it's crucial to avoid making generalizations about entire groups of people based on individual stories, whether it's Mr. Young's perspective or the experiences of the women he was involved with.
So before we wrap up, I want to turn things back to you, our listeners. What aspects of the story have resonated with you? What questions has it raised in your mind? We've delved into Mr. Young's account, but what are your thoughts on the broader themes we've touched on: social isolation, cross-cultural relationships, aging, and societal expectations?
We'd love to hear your reflections.
It's through these conversations that we can really unpack the nuances and consider the multiple perspectives within the story.
Absolutely. And while Mr. Young's perspective offers us a glimpse into this specific subculture, it's essential to remember that his experiences are just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Exactly. There's a whole other layer to consider: the experiences of the Filipino women he was involved with. Their voices and perspectives are crucial to gaining a more complete understanding of this complex situation.
And their stories often reveal the challenges and complexities of navigating cross-cultural relationships, particularly when power dynamics and economic disparities are at play. It's a reminder to be mindful of the broader context and the systemic factors that can shape these relationships.
Right. And it's also important to remember that we should avoid making generalizations about entire groups of people based on individual stories. Whether it's Mr. Young's perspective or the experiences of the women he was involved with, we should be careful not to extrapolate individual experiences to represent a larger group.
Well said. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Mr. Young's story, we hope you'll continue to ponder these questions. What does this story reveal about the intersections of aging, loneliness, cultural exchange, and perhaps even the yearning for connection in a rapidly evolving city like Hong Kong?
It's a story that challenges us to look beyond the surface and grapple with the complexities of human relationships in a globalized world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.